I first saw her through the blur of snow. A lone figure staggering up the ridge trail, each step dragging like she carried the whole storm on her back. The wind was sharp enough to lift a man's hat clean off his head, yet she walked bare-ankled skirts, torn arms, wrapped tight in what looked like nothing more than scraps of hide. I could see her sway with every gust, pausing now and then as though the next step might be her last. By the time she reached my porch, her cheeks were raw from the cold, and her hands shook against the doorframe. She didn't knock hard, just enough for me to hear. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever found yourself faced with a choice you knew could change a life. My name is Clara Whitford, and I was raised where the soil was thin, and work was the only way to see a season through. My father tilled a rocky patch of ground 10 miles from the nearest town, and my mother kept us steady with the Bible on Sundays and a firm belief that neighbors looked out for one another, no matter the hour or the weather. We made do with what we had: a milk cow, a garden that fought us every year, and the grit to carry on when others gave up. There was no extra for lace or frills, but our word was worth more than gold. When I married, I thought I was stepping into a life that matched the values I'd been taught. My husband preached to small congregations scattered along the stage road, and I followed cooking in camp kitchens and keeping to myself while he held services. We lived light, 2 trunks a tent and the road ahead. But I believed in the work and the good we were meant to do. Towns were a mixed blessing to me. They had fine stores and lamp-lit streets, but they also brought sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Some folks could measure your worth in dollars, and I learned quickly that a woman alone in the street could be weighed and judged without a word spoken to her. It was in one of those towns, after a long summer of travel, that the ground shifted under me. Whispers started not about my cooking or my sewing, but about the way some men looked when I passed. My husband didn't ask what truth there was in it. He simply decided there'd be less trouble if I weren't beside him at all. One morning, he left me standing in the main street with a worn carpetbag, saying only that I was no longer his concern. From that moment, the road was mine alone, and the miles ahead offered no welcome. I traded chores for scraps of food, walked through more than one night, with frost biting my hands, and came to know the sound of a latch sliding shut before I could plead my case. By the time the snow set in heavy, I had counted 12 doors closed against me. The 13th was just ahead that day. Its roofline dark against the white hills, smoke curling from a chimney that looked as if it had burned steady for years. My feet ached, my shawl was little more than a rag, but I made it to the sagging gate. I pushed it open, crossed the drifted yard, and raised my hand to knock, not knowing yet if I'd be turned back into the wind or see the door open at last. Jonas stood in the doorway longer than most men would have the cold swirling in around him, snow clinging to the brim of his hat. His gaze traveled from my face to my feet, then back again. No words came from him. He stepped aside, giving me just enough space to pass. I crossed the threshold, and the heat from the fire struck me like a weight pulling the strength from my legs. My hand found the door frame to steady myself. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke and something simmering on the stove, a smell that made my stomach cramp with hunger. The cabin was built from heavy beams, each darkened by years of smoke and use. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its fire glowing low but steady. A bed sat behind a curtain near the back. The table held 2 chairs, though one looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time. Jonas moved across the room with a faint drag in his step, his right leg stiff, his boots scraping the planks. Without speaking, he pulled a folded blanket from a crate and set it on the chair nearest the door, then returned to the hearth. I stayed standing until my knees gave out, then lowered myself to the floor near the fire. The blanket came around me in a tight wrap, the coarse wool scratching against my skin, but it trapped the heat where I needed it most. My hands still shook, Jonas ladled something thick into a tin bowl and placed it on the floor beside me. I cupped it with both hands, the steam clouding my view for a moment. He sat back in the chair by the fire, elbows on his knees, watching the flames. When I'd finished, I set the bowl down, pulling the blanket tighter across my chest. "Thank you," I said. His eyes lifted briefly, but no reply came. The fire burned low. The wind outside rattled the panes, and still we stayed as we were him in the chair, me on the floor listening to the snap of the logs. Sleep took me there, my back to the hearth, the blanket pulled up to my chin. Morning light filtered weakly through the frosted windows. Jonas was already at the stove, adding kindling to the fire, his coat and hat on. I sat up, the stiffness in my shoulders, a reminder of the floorboards. "Good morning," I said, my voice rough. He gave a nod, nothing more. The scent of cold air clung to him as he moved to the table. I asked if there was anything I could do. His answer was simple. Cornmeal's in the sack, beans in the pot. He stepped back, letting me pass. I stirred the beans, the wooden spoon heavy in my hand, while he sat at the table with his fingers laced together. "You live all the way out here alone?" I asked. Another nod. "Family anywhere?" His eyes stayed on the table. "No." I told him about my husband, then how he had left me in the middle of a town I barely knew. How the whispers had started and the doors had closed. Jonas kept his eyes on the fire, his face still, as though listening without wanting me to see his thoughts. "I'm not here to rob you or cause trouble," I said. "I can work." His reply was quiet. I didn't ask. That ended it. We ate in silence, tin spoons tapping the sides of the bowls. When I carried the dishes to the basin, Jonas's gaze followed me. He said most folks wouldn't have lasted through the storm without shelter. I told him I knew I would have died out there. The words hung in the warm air, and for the first time since I'd stepped inside, he looked at me not like a stranger, but like someone still standing after too many miles. Later, he pulled on his gloves and said he'd check the horses. I followed him to the door, the blanket still around my shoulders. The cold bit through the fabric as soon as I stepped outside. Beyond the cabin, the pasture stretched under a crust of snow, the barn leaning under its weight. Jonas walked toward the shed, his boots leaving deep prints, and I realized the place looked as worn and quiet as the man himself. The days that followed took on a rhythm without either of us naming it. I swept the floor each morning, hauled water when the cold allowed, and cooked what there was. Jonas kept to his chores, mending fences, chopping wood, tending the stock, speaking only when something needed saying. In the evenings, the fire was our only light, and the silence between us wasn't uneasy, just unfilled. On the fourth morning, I found him outside before dawn, splitting logs. Steam rose from his shoulders in the sharp air, the axe falling in a steady rhythm. The coat he'd lent me hung past my knees, its wool lined and worn, but warm. "Can I help?" I asked. He handed me a smaller hatchet without a word. My first 2 swings missed. The third split through. He didn't correct me or take the tool away, just let me keep at it until my hands ached. That night I stood by the fire, working the soreness from my fingers. Jonas passed behind me and set down a small tin of salve. I met his eyes briefly, then nodded. "Thank you." Outside, a windstorm rattled the walls. Inside, I spoke into the quiet. "Some folks in town said your place was cursed, that you went strange after your family died." His answer came low. "They're not wrong." I asked why he'd opened the door then. His shoulders lifted in a slight shrug. Didn't see the point in letting someone die that close to the fire. The words settled between us, heavier than the silence. I took a step closer. Most men would have still shut the door. He didn't answer right away. Then, steady as before, he said, "You're not a burden." The fire cracked, the wind pushed against the walls, and I felt something shift in the space between us. We didn't speak again that night, but when I lay down on the rug near the hearth, the sound of the logs popping was different, less like a wall keeping out the cold, and more like something holding steady for us both. By the next morning, the storm had eased, leaving a pale light over the snowdrifts. Jonas was at the table pulling on his boots. "Going to town," he said. I looked at the door, the trail beyond it, and knew the quiet we'd kept here would not follow us there. The trail into Hollow's Bluff was hard-packed and frozen, the snow along the edges worn thin by wagon wheels and hooves. Jonas rode ahead on his bay mare, his shoulders squared against the cold, while I followed on a mule he'd saddled for me. The coat he'd lent me hung heavy, its wool collar turned up to guard my face from the wind. We didn't speak much as the town came into view, just the faint creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves on hard earth. From a distance, Hollow's Bluff seemed still, but as we passed the livery and the saloon eyes turned toward us. Women paused on the porch of the mercantile skirts, brushing against the planks as they shifted to get a better look. An old man leaned on the hitch rail outside the smithy, his gaze following us as we rode by. Even a boy sweeping the steps of the sheriff's office stopped to watch. Their faces didn't show much, but the weight of their attention settled on my shoulders. Jonas tied his mare to the post outside the feed store and stepped inside without waiting. I followed, closing the door against the chill. The place smelled of dry grain and canvas. Behind the counter, a broad man with a gray beard nodded at Jonas. They spoke in short, familiar tones about sacks of oats and salt. I stayed near the door, keeping my eyes on the floorboards worn smooth by years of boots. The quiet broke when a voice came from the back of the store. "Pick her up, off the road, Jonas." The words carried a lazy drawl, but the smirk in them was sharp enough to cut. I turned and saw a man leaning against a barrel, his coat dusty, his hat tipped back to show a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Jonas didn't turn. "Sure don't look like your wife," the man added. The clerk stiffened, but kept his hands on the counter. Jonas turned, then slow and steady, his voice low. "Say that again." The man shrugged, shifting his weight. "Just wondering if she's your cook or something else." The clerk stepped in, his tone firm. "That's enough, Cal. You want to keep your teeth, you head on out." The man's eyes flicked to me once more before he pushed off the barrel and walked out the door, slamming behind him. Jonas finished paying, lifted the sack of feed, and stepped outside without looking back. We rode out of town with the same quiet we'd come in with. The air was sharp and still, only the leather creak, hot, and hoofbeats breaking it. Halfway up the trail, I said, "You should have let him speak his piece." "That's what they all think, anyway." Jonas kept his eyes ahead. "I don't care what they think. They think I'm staying with you for warmth and food," I said. "That I begged my way into your bed." His reply was as even as before. "You didn't." My grip tightened on the reins. "That doesn't matter to them." Jonas pulled his mare to a halt and turned in the saddle to face me. "It matters to me. I took you in because you were cold and near gone. You stayed because you work harder than most men I know. That's not shame." The trail bent upward toward the ridge, the wind curling around us. I asked, "Do you want me to leave?" His brow furrowed. "No. Let them talk." He didn't look away until I gave a small nod. We started forward again, the mule following the mare's slow, steady climb. That night, when we reached the cabin, I set my things by the bed curtain instead of near the hearth. Jonas didn't remark on it. We moved through the evening as we always did, supper cooked, dishes washed, fire stoked for the night. When it came time to turn in, I lay down beside him without the space we'd kept before. My back rested against his chest, and his arm came around my waist, the weight of it steady and sure. In the days that followed, the snow still lay deep in the shaded hollows, but the light lasted longer. Jonas worked along the back fence where the rails had been pushed down by the drifts. I planted onion sets in the soil behind the shed, my fingers numb from the cold ground, but certain it would be worth it come spring. We didn't speak much while we worked, yet every task felt shared. Evenings grew warmer in the cabin. I kept the small garden plot tended, cooked the suppers from whatever we had left, and mended a tear in the cuff of Jonas's shirt. He brought in fresh water for the basin before I asked and stacked extra wood by the hearth. The bed no longer held a line between us. Some nights his hand would rest lightly on my hip. Some mornings my foot would brush his leg before we both rose to start the day. One evening I stood at the basin washing the pan sleeves rolled to my elbows. Jonas leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching without speaking. The firelight from behind him caught on the worn edges of his shirt. "Why haven't you asked me to leave?" I said. He tilted his head slightly. "Would it matter if I had?" I dried my hands on a cloth. "It would." "Then I won't," he said. I looked at him for a long moment, then asked, "What if someone comes looking, my husband?" "He's still out there." Jonas didn't move from the doorway. "You think he'd come for you?" I nodded once. If he knew where I was, yes. Jonas stepped to the small table, opened a drawer, and took out a revolver. He set it down between us. "I don't scare easy," he said. "And I don't let go of what's mine." I met his eyes. "I'm not yours." His voice stayed even. "Not unless you say so." I reached for his hand, not the gun. "I'm not running anymore," I said. The heat from the stove pressed against my back as he closed his fingers around mine. That night I undressed before climbing into bed, the quilt pulled up to my shoulders. Jonas followed his movements slow, his eyes steady. When his hand touched my cheek, it was warm and sure. We came together without hurry, without fear. And when I lay against him, after my cheek resting on his chest, the only sound was the steady beat beneath my ear. Outside, the wind eased over the ridge, and the fire burned low. By the first weeks of thaw, the snow had broken into patches along the ridge, leaving the ground dark and wet where the sun lingered. Jonas worked the far fence line with steady strokes of his hammer, the sound carrying across the open stretch between us. I knelt near the shed, loosening the soil where I'd planted onion sets weeks earlier, the tips just now showing green through the damp earth. The air was warmer, though the wind still cut when the clouds moved in front of the sun. We'd fallen into a pattern that neither of us had named. I kept the cabin in order, saw to the cooking, and tended to the small plot behind the shed. Jonas repaired what winter had worn down, brought in wood without my asking, and kept the animals fed. The quiet between us had changed, not empty, but settled like a fire that burned low yet steady through the night. That evening I brushed out my hair at the table, easing the tangles that had gathered over the winter. Jonas sat in his chair near the fire, his gaze steady but without pressure. "Why haven't you told me to leave?" I asked, my voice low enough to keep it between us. He leaned back slightly, one boot resting over the other. "Would it matter if I had?" "It would," I answered. He gave a single nod. "Then I won't." I paused, the brush still in my hand. "What if someone comes looking, my husband? He knows how to find his way to most towns out here." Jonas didn't shift his eyes on mine. "You think he'd come for you?" I nodded once. "If he knew where I was, yes." He rose without hurry and crossed to the small cabinet near the door. From the drawer he took out a revolver and set it on the table between us. His tone was steady. "I don't scare easy, and I don't let go of what's mine." I held his gaze. "I'm not yours." His answer came without hesitation. "Not unless you say so." I reached across the table and took his hand, leaving the gun where it lay. "I'm not running anymore," I said. His fingers closed around mine, rough and warm. The fire popped once in the hearth, the only sound in the room. That night I undressed before climbing under the quilt. Jonas sat at the edge of the bed, pulling off his boots, his movements measured. When he lay beside me, his hand came to my cheek first, then to my waist, his touch firm but without demand. We came together slowly, each motion certain, unhurried. When I rested my head on his chest, after the quiet wasn't guarded, it was full, the kind that held. The days lengthened, and the air carried the smell of thawed earth. I hung laundry in the yard while Jonas mended the roof above the porch. The sound of his boots on the shingles was steady, measured the hammering in time with the breeze. By supper time, the roof was sound, the linens dry, and the cabin felt less like a shelter against the cold, and more like a place meant to be lived in. A week later, the sheriff rode up the trail. His horse slowed near the gate, the dust from the road clinging to its legs. I stepped out onto the porch as Jonas came from the side yard, wiping his hands on a rag. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Had a man come through town a few days back. Preacher type said he was looking for a woman." My hands tightened on the porch rail. Jonas said nothing. The sheriff glanced toward me, said she was his wife, claimed she stole from him. Town didn't take kindly to his preaching on the street. A few of the ranch hands told him if he stepped foot past the general store again, he'd be buried under it. He adjusted his hat against the sun. Man left before sundown. Had the look of someone who knew he'd already lost. I let out a slow breath. Jonas's stance didn't change. The sheriff looked between us once more. Folks in town have heard the talk. They've also seen how quiet things have stayed up here. No one's worried. Jonas gave a single nod. Good. The sheriff turned his horse, tipping his hat again. "You need anything, you send word." Jonas stepped inside the door, closing behind him. I stayed on the porch a moment longer, watching the dust settle along the trail. Then I walked down to the gate and latched it. The sound of the metal catch settling into place was small, but it felt final. A week after the sheriff's visit, the day settled into a calmer rhythm. Jonas rose early, often gone to the far pasture before the light fully reached the porch. I kept to the cabin in the morning chill, feeding the stove until the air warmed, then starting breakfast from what we had in the pantry. The garden behind the shed began to show more green each day, each shoot pushing through the soil like a small promise. One morning, as I hung laundry on the line, Jonas came back from the north fence with a strip of pine in his hand. "From the rail out front," he said. "Thought it might serve for something." He carried it to the porch and set it against the rail where the sun touched the wood. Later that evening, after the supper dishes were washed and stacked, he took a small carving knife from the drawer and began shaping the pine into two narrow bands. He didn't say what they were for, and I didn't ask, but the sound of the blade moving over the wood carried in the quiet. 2 days later, he placed one of the finished rings on the table while I was folding linens. "You don't need it," he said, "but I'd like you to have it." The band was smooth, the grain catching the light from the window. I slipped it over my finger, the fit exact. "It fits," I said. Jonas only nodded and went back to tending the fire. Not long after, I began to feel a change in my body, a heaviness in the morning, a stillness that hadn't been there before. I kept it to myself for a few days, thinking it might pass, but the knowing stayed. One afternoon, after Jonas came in from feeding the stock, I told him straight. "I think I'm carrying a child." He looked at me for a long moment, his hand still on the doorframe. "You sure?" I nodded. He stepped forward and wrapped me in his arms, his breath slowing against my hair. No more words were needed. In the weeks that followed, our trips into Hollow's Bluff were different. I no longer trailed behind or kept my eyes down. We walked into the mercantile side by side, the wooden band playing on my finger, and no one spoke against it. Folks still looked, but the stares didn't carry the same weight they once had. I chose to meet them, my chin level. Jonas never hurried me, never pulled me along. At home, the cabin took on more shape. I mended the curtain that hung near the bed and set a jar of early blooms on the table. Jonas patched the spot in the porch roof where rain had been coming through. In the evenings we sat by the hearth, sometimes talking, sometimes quiet, the sound of the fire filling the space. One evening, as the light faded and the air cooled, I stepped outside to take down the wash. Across the ridge, the sky was streaked with the last of the sun. I heard hooves on the trail before I saw the rider, the steady rhythm carrying through the still air. Jonas came to the porch, his hand resting on the post as the figure came into view. Whoever it was rode with purpose, their coat catching the wind in dark folds. By the time they reached the gate, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving only the sound of the horse's breath and the creak of saddle leather between us. The rider at the gate drew his horse to a stop, the animal's breath showing in short clouds against the cooling air. He was tall in the saddle, his coat buttoned high, hat brim pulled low over his brow. Jonas stepped down from the porch, his boots sounding solid on the packed earth. I stayed where I was, the last of the wash basket resting against my hip. Evening, the man said, his voice steady but carrying weight. Name's Deputy Marshal Cole Anders. I'm looking for Jonas Hale. Jonas gave a short nod. That's me. Anders glanced my way briefly, then back to Jonas. Mind if I step inside? Jonas moved to unlatch the gate and waved him through. Inside, the marshal removed his hat and settled at the table while Jonas poured coffee from the pot on the stove. I hung the damp clothes near the hearth to finish drying, keeping one ear on them. Anders thanked him for the cup, took a slow sip, then set it down. Had word come through Fort Bridger last week, he began. A preacher traveling east, making noise about a woman he says wronged him. Claims she's living under another man's roof, taking what isn't hers. Jonas didn't look at me, but I felt the air in the room shift. And you came all this way to ask about it, he said evenly. Anders shook his head. Not to ask. To tell you it's talk that's reaching further than town. He's got a way of stirring folk up, and there's men who'll follow a story like that for their own reasons. I set the last shirt on the chair back and stepped closer to the table. What exactly are you saying, Marshal? He met my eyes, his expression even. I'm saying it's best you both know there's a chance someone will come looking and not for conversation. Jonas's hand rested flat on the table. Appreciate the warning, he said. Anders finished his coffee and stood adjusting the lay of his coat. I'll be riding back through in 2 days. If you see anything out of place, send word through the post at Hollow's Bluff. Jonas walked him to the porch, and I followed just far enough to see the rider head back down the trail, his silhouette fading into the dusk. That night we ate in near silence, the fire giving off a low, steady heat. Jonas cleaned the plates while I checked the shutters and dropped the bar across the front door. When I turned back, he was standing by the small cabinet near the bed curtain, setting his rifle where it could be reached quickly. You think he'll really come this far? I asked. Jonas took his time answering. Don't know. But if he does, we'll be ready. The following day, Jonas spent the morning in the yard, checking the hinges on the gate and the latches on the barn doors. I worked in the garden until the sun was high, then carried water to the porch to wash. Every so often, my eyes went to the ridgeline, tracing the path a rider might take. In the afternoon, Jonas brought in more firewood than usual, stacking it tight against the side wall of the cabin. Enough to last a week without stepping outside, he said. I nodded understanding without him having to say more. Supper was simple beans and salt pork, eaten with the kind of quiet that wasn't from lack of words, but from holding them back until they were needed. Near nightfall, Jonas pulled 2 bedrolls from the chest and set one near the hearth. Easier to hear what's coming from here than behind a curtain, he said. I agreed and laid out my things beside his. The fire threw shadows against the far wall, and the wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of damp earth from the thaw. We didn't speak of the preacher's name, but his presence was in the room all the same. When I finally lay down, Jonas was still sitting upright, the rifle across his knees, listening to the night beyond the walls. The wind was still when I woke, but the air held a weight that didn't belong to morning. Jonas was already at the table, setting cartridges into the rifle's loading gate with slow, measured care. He looked up when I stepped from my bedroll, the lamplight showing the deep lines around his eyes. "We've got company," he said quietly. I crossed to the shutter and eased it open just enough to see a lone rider on the far slope keeping to the higher ground. The horse was moving at a walk, the rider's hat brim, low face in shadow. Jonas slid the rifle into the crook of his arm and stepped to the door. "Stay inside until I call," he told me. His voice wasn't sharp, but it left no space for argument. I watched from the window as he walked to the gate boots, sinking into the soft earth. The rider halted just beyond the fence, dismounted, and tied his reins to the post. When he stepped forward, I saw his face clear in the morning light. Reverend Ellis. His coat was worn at the edges, dust clinging to the fabric, but his eyes carried the same cold weight they had the last time I'd seen them. "Jonas Hale," he said, voice carrying across the short stretch. "I've come for what's mine." Jonas's stance didn't change. "You came a long way for talk that won't get you what you want." Ellis's gaze shifted toward the cabin. Even from that distance, I felt it on me. He stepped closer to the gate. "That woman belongs with her husband. She's been living in sin under your roof, taking what doesn't belong to her." Jonas's reply was steady. "You lost the right to speak on her life when you turned her out into the cold." Ellis's jaw tightened. "She's my wife under the law, and I'll have her back." Jonas shook his head once. "The law's a circuit judge who will be in Hollow's Bluff come Monday. You want to make your claim, you do it there." For a moment I thought Ellis might push the gate open, but instead he stepped back. "Monday then. But until that day, remember this, folks in these parts don't look kindly on thieves and liars." His eyes flicked to me one last time before he turned and mounted his horse. Jonas watched until he was no more than a dark mark against the horizon. When he came back inside, he set the rifle on the table and pulled out a chair. "We've got 2 days to be ready," he said. The hours that followed moved slow. Jonas rode into Hollow's Bluff for supplies while I stayed to tend the stock and keep the fire going. Each time I stepped out to the yard, I scanned the ridge lines, watching for any movement. When Jonas returned, he carried more than food and lamp oil. He set down a folded paper sealed with twine. "Sworn statement from Deputy Marshal Anders," he said. "Says you've been here under my protection since the day we met, and that Ellis's conduct put your life in danger." I turned the paper in my hands, feeling its weight. "Will that hold in front of a judge?" Jonas poured coffee and handed me a cup. "It's a start. Truth's got to be spoken plain if it's to stand." That evening, we went over every detail the night Ellis cast me out the weather, the miles I walked, and how Jonas had found me near the trading road. Jonas wrote it down in his careful block letters, his hand steady even when mine trembled. We didn't speak much after that. The fire burned low, and outside the night settled in deep. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called, and the sound carried longer than it should have. Jonas checked the latch on the door twice before bedding down with the rifle close at hand. I lay awake for a long while, listening to the wind work its way around the cabin. Monday would come quick, and with it the reckoning. Monday came with a pale sky, and the kind of stillness that made every sound travel far. Jonas and I rode into Hollow's Bluff before the sun had cleared the ridge, the frost crunching under the horses' hooves. Folks were already gathering near the courthouse, drawn by the promise of a dispute worth talking about. Inside, the wood stove was glowing, but the air still held a chill. Judge Harlan sat at the bench, spectacles low on his nose, hands folded over a sheaf of papers. Reverend Ellis stood near the front, his coat buttoned high, eyes set on me the moment I stepped through the door. Jonas stayed at my side as we took our place. The judge called for quiet and asked Ellis to speak first. His voice was steady but cold, painting a picture of a wayward wife who had abandoned her vows. He spoke of law of reputation, of a place he claimed I belonged. When it was Jonas's turn, he laid the sworn statement from Deputy Marshal Anders on the table. He spoke of the night he'd found me, half frozen of the tracks in the snow, leading away from Ellis's door, of the days it took before I could even stand without faltering. The judge read the statement in silence, then looked at me. "Mrs. Ellis, do you wish to say anything?" My hands were steady on the rail. I told him I had been cast out without cause, that no vows could bind me to harm, and that my home was now where I was treated with dignity. The room stayed quiet long after I finished. Judge Harlan adjusted his spectacles and spoke in a voice that carried to the back wall. "This court finds no standing for the Reverend's claim. Mrs. Ellis is free to remain where she chooses." Ellis's jaw worked, but he said nothing. He turned on his heel and left his boots striking the floor in sharp echoes. I didn't watch him go. My eyes stayed on Jonas, who gave a small nod as if to say it was done. Outside, the cold air felt lighter. The people who had come to watch drifted away in twos and threes, their voices low. Jonas untied the horses, and we rode home without hurry. The trail quiet except for the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves. That night, the fire in the cabin burned warm. I set the coffee pot near the coals, listening to the wind move gently through the pines. Justice in these parts didn't always come easy, but when it did, it settled deep like roots holding firm in the earth. Out here, family wasn't just blood. It was the ones who stood with you when the weather turned, who kept the door open and the lantern lit. That's the kind of home I chose, and the kind I'll keep. If this story settles in your mind, think of the people who've stood by you when it mattered most. And if you care to hear more tales like mine, well, you're welcome to come back and listen again.